Tonight on Primetime Politics, results overturned.
It's a small day for Nathalie Sinclair-Desgagnés, but it's a big day for democracy.
The Supreme Court annuls the federal election results in the Montreal area riding of Terrebonne, a riding won by the Liberals by a single vote last April. Coming up, the Ottawa Bureau Chiefs will examine what it might mean for an early election. Also, trade mission to Mexico. We will speak with Parliamentary Secretary Rachel Bendayan, part of a huge delegation involving government and business as Ottawa looks to diversify where Canadian goods are going. And voting down Trump's tariffs against Canada. How Ottawa should react to this week's vote in the U.S. Congress. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. Well, voters in the Montreal area riding of Terrebonne will be going back to the polls. On Friday afternoon, the Supreme Court annulled last April's election result in that riding, meaning the Liberals have just lost another MP. Now, on election night, the riding of Terrebonne kept swinging between the Liberal and the Bloc Québécois candidates, with initial results declaring a Liberal victory by 25 votes. But when the counts were validated, the seat flipped, and the BQ incumbent was declared the winner by 44 votes. That triggered an official recount, and again the seat flipped, declaring Liberal Tatiana Auguste once again the new MP by 1 vote. The results were taken to court by the BQ that also found one voter who says her mail-in ballot was not counted because of a postal error. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and that brings us to today, Friday, and the decision to annul the results. Here is the reaction from BQ candidate Nathalie Sinclair-Desgagnés.
There was one vote that was cast. It was cast well in advance, and it wasn't counted. Why? Because Elections Canada not only made a mistake in the postal code, but they also made a mistake in not correcting their mistake. They didn't tell the electors that were affected by their mistake that their vote might not be casted, and they should have, and that's what the Supreme Court just ruled.
Well, I did earlier speak with the Bureau Chiefs on this matter. Take a listen now to Robert Fife, the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, Tonda MacCharles, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, and Joël-Denis Bellavance, the Ottawa Bureau Chief for La Presse. So, here we have a government that has been trying to build a majority without necessarily going to the polls. They've been trying to pick up, floor crossers. We saw 2. And now comes this ruling from the Supreme Court that annuls the results in Terrebonne. How bad is this for the government, Bob?
Well, we're going to have 3 by-elections now because we have the seat that Krista Freeland gave up, as well as Bill Blair was going off to the High Commissioner. And now we have this decision. I'm pretty sure that the ones in Scarborough and in Rosedale, which are the 2 Toronto ridings, are probably pretty safe for the Liberals. I'm not sure what the playground is in Quebec. That had been a long time PQ riding, and it just flipped by 1 vote for the Liberals. I don't know whether Mr. Carney has the coattails to be able to win that riding. So it's going to be really interesting to see whether he can pull it off. And if he doesn't, I think we're going to have a situation where the Prime Minister is going to have to decide whether he tries to stick with the strong minority government, because it looks like he can't pull enough Conservatives over, or whether we have a spring election.
Mm-hmm. Tonda?
I mean, in the short term, it slightly changes the math for the Liberals in the House of Commons, and so but they still, as a minority, need cooperation from the other side to draw from it wherever they can to get things through. But we're seeing this week, that it looks like there's going to be less resistance. They've reached a deal now on moving forward with the Conservatives on the GST credit, the grocery credit that was brought in, and to bring that back to the House, that got royal assent rather, but to bring the Budget Implementation Act through committee quickly and back into the House quickly. So I expect you're going to see, as a result of kind of this still tentative minority situation, the Liberals making a few more concessions to the Conservatives. So in the short term, it doesn't change anything in Parliament right away. They still have to negotiate with the other side. In the bigger picture, Bob's right. What does it say about the Liberals' chances in Quebec, where I think, frankly, Carney's trade efforts have been met with pretty positive reviews?
And Joël-Denis?
Well, this story is a bit of a roller coaster, as you mentioned. It flipped many times. It's flipped again. It's the first time that the Supreme Court of Canada renders such a decision, cancelling an election that was held a year ago. Now, my sense is that it's going to be a tough battle between the Liberals and the Bloc Québécois, but Mr. Carney's his reputation is still very much strong in Quebec. He's seen as the adult in the House of Commons, but also in Canada as in general, facing Donald Trump. And so I would predict that the Liberals have a good chance of keeping that seat, especially that since Mr. Carney has put forward policies that will benefit the economy in the long term, and people understand that we're in a tough spot and we need some kind of stability. So I expect the Liberals to do quite well and even keep that seat, even though they won by they had won that election by 1 seat and now lost it by the result.
But she gets to run again if she wants to, with having had 8 months of basically incumbency and some profile there too, because the Prime Minister has put her forward on a couple of occasions to highlight her presence, her win initially. So she enters whatever by-election gets held with an advantage.
Exactly, and in the by-election calls, you can expect ministers, key ministers in Quebec, Mélanie Joly, François-Philippe Champagne, who are very good campaigners, to be there to try to keep that seat for the Liberals.
That riding is going to have a lot of Liberal money flowing in there.
And visitors.
Well, but, let me pick up on the point that you were making, Bob, because I hear what you're saying, that Quebecers may be happy with the economic decisions and the proclamations made by the Prime Minister, but is that a long enough coattail to carry a riding where even at its widest margin was 44 votes as it went back and forth between the BQ and the Liberals?
I think so. I think so, because now the proof is more and more in the pudding, and the pudding that people see from Quebec is a very delicious one, if I may say, if we talk about food. But
but I think it also, bears watching that riding for how the BQ plays out the separatist line of argument in a campaign, right?
That's a very good point.
I'll be watching for that.
Yeah, I think there's a larger issue here. Mark Carney is 29 percentage points ahead of Pierre Poilievre as preferred Prime Minister. The Liberal Party is around 5 to 9%, depending on which poll, now ahead of the Conservatives, which is a significant change from the last a few months when they've been, or last year actually, when they've been sort of neck and neck in terms of the party. And this is a Prime Minister who wants to get things done. And he hasn't shown an over-willingness to try to cooperate with other parties. The Conservatives, for the last year after the election campaign, have not been cooperative at all. After Christmas, with these poll numbers, all of a sudden, Pierre Poilievre is talking about, well, let's cooperate with the government on legislation and on issues. And that's largely because he's fearful that there's going to be an election campaign. Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, had a meeting with Carney, and he's saying, pull the plug. The numbers are going in your favor, and it'll only get worse because who knows what's going to happen with the negotiations with the United States on continental free trade. The economy is still funny. We've got potentially separatism in Quebec, a separatist or a referendum in Alberta. There's lots of things in play here. And one thing we know about the Liberals, I'll quote Alan McEachern back from the 1980s when they defeated Joe Clark. He said this, Jim Coots in his diary, do you think we're power hungry? And then he answered it himself, you're damn right we're power hungry.
Okay.
In a future by-elections in Terrebonne, it will be interesting to see how the national unity issue plays out. Whether the Parti québécois will be campaigning with Bloc Québécois candidates in that riding. And that could be, something that pushed back the support for the Bloc Québécois. And that would say, if you play the national unity card, you've got Mélanie Joly and François-Philippe Champagne going there, the Liberals have a good chance to keeping it.
And that was Robert Fife, Tonda MacCharles, and Joël-Denis Bellavance, part of this week's episode of the Bureau Chiefs with Michael Serapio, a Primetime Politics podcast from CPAC. A new episode is out right now. You can listen anywhere you get your podcasts. You can also watch it on YouTube. Well, as Parliament takes a break next week, a delegation of hundreds will be making their way to Mexico. A delegation that includes Ministers Dominic LeBlanc, Heath MacDonald, and Mark Miller, also several parliamentary secretaries. This as the Canadian government tries to increase trade with NAFTA's so-called third amigo. Now, back in September, the Prime Minister did travel to Mexico to meet with President Claudia Sheinbaum, and out of that meeting formed an action plan, one that aims to deepen ties between the two countries, including economic ties, which laid the path for what we will see next week. Well, with more on this trade mission to Mexico, we're now joined by the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Montreal area MP Rachel Bendayan. Ms. Bendayan, thank you for the time.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Listen, I'm going to get to the Mexico trip in a second, but you know, as you and I are speaking, I'm sure you've heard about the ruling from the Supreme Court regarding Terrebonne. I'm wondering what your reaction is to that, first and foremost.
Look, I'm a lawyer by training. In my previous life, I was at Norton Rose Fulbright for 10 years. I respect the Supreme Court decision. I think our institutions are what hold up our democracy. And I'm ready to fight in a by-election in Terrebonne. You'll probably see me hit the road pretty soon.
Okay, so we will be watching that closely. Listen, let's now shift over to the trade mission to Mexico, because we're talking about a very huge delegation here, some 240 organizations, more than 300 delegates when you look at the primary work on it. What are you hoping to accomplish by the end of next week?
It's 370 delegates coming with us. This is incredible. It's one of the largest, if not the largest, trade missions that Canada will ever undertake. I'm going to take my flight tomorrow. What are we hoping for? I'm hoping for deals. I'm going to be very honest. The objective of this trade mission is to translate some of the agreements, in particular the agreement that Prime Minister Carney signed with President Sheinbaum back in September. I was there with him for those discussions. I want to translate that into more exports to Mexico for our Canadian businesses. The benefit of having these agreements is really to give opportunities to our entrepreneurs. And so, as you mentioned, tons of small businesses are going to be joining us. 370 delegates will be having over about 1,500 B2B meetings. Business-to-business meetings are what this trade mission is all about.
So a lot of meetings that they're going to take place there. But, you know, Canada has had a free trade deal with Mexico for decades. You know, NAFTA was signed back in 1992. But in the 3 decades since that time, neither country seems to have been really focused on growing that trade. One figure I saw, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but one figure I saw says that trade between Canada and Mexico only counts for less than 3% of each other's overall trade exports. Are there systemic barriers or prevailing attitudes that you need to be watching out for and trying to overcome with these meetings?
Well, it is our third largest trading partner, Mexico. It represents about $56 billion in trade between our two countries. Is there more to do? Absolutely, which is why we're going. It's why we're bringing so many businesses with us. I think that Mexicans are particularly interested in what we have to offer in terms of technology, particularly in the manufacturing space, but also in the clean tech space. We have enormous potential in agri and agri-food, as well as in the creative sectors. And that's why our Heritage Minister is joining our trip, and we'll be in Guadalajara with many of our creative industries, while Minister LeBlanc will be in Monterrey with many of our tech businesses. I'll be in Mexico City. It is just it's a huge Canadian delegation as well, as you probably saw, with many from government attending in order to cover as many bases as possible. I think that there is enormous opportunity, and you'll probably see over the course of next week some deals even being signed. So I think there's going to be some real tangible results from this trade mission.
You know, and the Prime Minister, and you mentioned the trip back in September when he was in Mexico meeting with President Sheinbaum, she noted the fact, or said that a new bilateral deal would not be required to facilitate more trade. But would it be wise to pursue a bilateral deal given the uncertainty around North American trade and the treaty right now?
I mean, I think the strategic partnership that we signed in September sets out a good frame for how we can further trade between our two countries. At this time, both Canada, Mexico, and the United States are obviously involved in the process resulting from, I was going to say TMEC, which is how they call it in Mexico, CUSMA here in Canada. And I think that it's important for us to recall that signing agreements is great. The Prime Minister signed actually 12 different economic and security partnerships over the last 6 months. It's incredible. And now what we want to do is start to translate that into more exports for our Canadian companies, and that'll give greater resilience to our Canadian economy overall.
Mm-hmm. You know, we have about a minute here, but I wonder if you could leave us with a bit of a picture for Canadians, because I would argue that for the vast majority of Canadians, they see Mexico as a tourist destination, and really mainly that, despite this trade relationship we've had with them for decades. How important is Mexico right now? How does it fit into the greater puzzle that your government's trying to achieve in terms of diversifying our trade beyond the United States?
I think it plays a very large role, in addition, of course, to many other allies, including in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific. Mexico right now has, I believe, almost 100 different Canadian mining companies operating. We have enormous potential to further and deepen in the energy sector, but there are also several other sectors, many of which I mentioned as being key to this trade mission, where we can further deepen our relationship and continue to grow. I think also of Mexican foreign direct investment into Canada, that can certainly increase. That's part of the work that I am undertaking. And as you can see, it's really a full government approach, with the Minister of Agriculture also joining this trade mission, and many other members of our caucus who are going to be there. And we are each taking a different sector, a different piece of the puzzle in order to drill down. Now is the time that we are going to not only grow our Canadian economy, but make it more resilient in the face of the geopolitical uncertainty that I know is causing a lot of stress for a lot of Canadians.
Rachel Bendayan, thank you for this safe trip to Mexico.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Well, as we talk about trade, there is word in the United States that Donald Trump is planning to scale back some of the tariffs applied to steel and aluminum going into the U.S. Now, we don't know if that applies to Canadian steel and aluminum, but if that happened, it would signal a walk back from some tough talk that we've heard from the U.S. president in the past. It would also follow a resolution that passed earlier this week in the U.S. Congress, a resolution that called on the White House to end emergency tariffs against Canadian goods.
We have farmers, agricultural producers in western Colorado and southern Colorado that are impacted by these tariffs. We also have the largest steel rail manufacturer in the United States in Pueblo, Colorado, in my district, and they were affected by this as well. So at the end of the day, I looked at the Constitution, I looked at what was in the best interests of my district, and I took the vote. It's not easy, but it's the right thing, and I stand by it.
Okay, well, let's explore these recent developments. We're now joined by trade advisor Eric Miller, president of the Rideau Potomac Strategy Group. Eric Miller, thank you for making the time.
Thank you for having me on. So
we're now waiting to see if there will be any movement on Canadian steel and aluminum. But we did see that vote on Wednesday on the so-called IEEPA tariffs on Canada. You know, probably worthwhile as we start this discussion to walk through what this actually would mean for this country. Which Canadian products would actually get tariff relief if, and it's a very big if this resolution actually comes to pass?
Well, if this resolution were to actually be adopted and signed into law by the president, then you would see a broad removal of those 35% tariffs that we've heard so much about on an array of products that are not the so-called 232 products. So we think about steel and aluminum and automotive and copper and things of that nature. What you could think of as the special categories, those would not be covered by this, but it would be the tariffs on everything else. And I think that what is important to keep in mind, though, is that the House passed the bill quite narrowly, and that President Trump would almost certainly veto any measure repealing tariffs on Canada that would hit his desk.
Yeah, absolutely, which is why it's unlikely. But still, the very fact that you have Congress and amongst them a handful of Republicans willing to push back, what does that tell you about the motivation behind this shift in attitude?
Well, I think it's a critically important milestone. What we have seen in the first year of the Trump administration is a Congress that has been thoroughly unwilling to push back on President Trump's trade agenda. And what that has meant is that he has implemented and changed any number of tariffs on countries around the world. What you are seeing in Congress is an indication that a small but important number of Republicans have grown frustrated with the tariff agenda, escalating costs, and I think is fair to say are certainly concerned about the deteriorating state of the Canada-U.S. relationship as we head into the CUSMA renegotiation.
So how should Canadian officials be reacting to this? Of course, we at one point had retaliatory tariffs. Those were dropped. We're still dealing with tariffs on Canadian goods as they stand. What should the tactic be right now? To stand back and let this work its way through domestic politics? What would your advice be?
So I think what Canada needs to do now is to get a date and a time for a good first discussion with the United States in the formal context of the review. You've seen the Mexican economy minister in Washington having discussions. Canada has not really had serious discussions with the U.S. since the breakdown in the fall, and there needs to be discussions moving in that direction. What I would say, though, is that for those who might advise that Canadians just need to sit back and wait for the U.S. political process to do its work, I would not counsel that, because with only 6 Republicans willing to break ranks from their own party in the House of Representatives, you're not looking at anywhere close to a critical mass that would be needed to fundamentally change U.S. policy. So things remain that Donald Trump calls all of the shots, and Canada needs to proceed on that basis.
Proceed on that basis, get talks going on the CUSMA review, which you're alluding to. Let's talk about that, because 2026 is the review year for what replaced NAFTA. What would be, for Canada, the ideal scenario would be the status quo. That seems unlikely. So what would you say is the realistic goal right now for Canada, given the trade priorities of this current administration?
Well, Canada's number one goal, I think, would be to change as little as possible about the agreement. Fundamentally, what you're seeing is Donald Trump and the United States under him have become a great disruptor in the international order. And you heard a lot about this in Mark Carney's speech in Davos, but Canada, looking down the road, I think would like to maintain as much as possible of the superstructure so that you could have a reversion to somewhat normalized trade in the future if that's something that becomes possible. But certainly maintaining a trilateral workable agreement whose basis is fundamentally equal treatment among the parties has to be a critical priority. But to be clear, Canada is not the one seeking to make fundamental changes to the agreement here. And so it is reacting to a U.S. that really doesn't know what it wants to do at the present time and has oscillated between pulling out of the CUSMA agreement, making it a set of bilateral agreements, or proceeding on a trilateral basis. So they don't know, so it's very hard for Canada to proceed with negotiations. And so getting full discussions going on one's optimal option, i.e. the trilateral agreement, would be the best course of action, but that may be easier said than done.
Yeah, easier said than done, but it seems to be what you're suggesting is create a baseline here upon which it can be built upon in the future, if it can be.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Very quickly, losing time here, Eric, but 2026 is the review year of CUSMA. Is there a scenario where the review process could drag on beyond 2026 and Canada continues to live in this trade uncertainty, beyond the calendar year?
Yes, I think that that's a very realistic scenario, because the way that the process works is that at year 6, the countries are to review, is the agreement working the way it should be, or do we need changes? And the question gets asked, are you willing to extend this agreement for another 16 years? If the parties do not answer in the affirmative, then you go into a series of 10 annual reviews where essentially the question of are you ready to extend gets asked 10 times. And so there are a lot of opportunities to do that. And Donald Trump, being who he is, he may well see annual reviews as a point of leverage where he can come back year upon year upon year and extract what he would see as more concessions. And so if you are Canada, obviously you're trying to get stability and clarity about the rules of the road, but I could very easily see a scenario where this not only doesn't end on July 1st, it doesn't end on December 31st or even next year, and that we're going to be asking this question really for the foreseeable future, which will pose strains on Canada and its economy.
Yeah, which explains why Canada is trying to find alternate trade partners right now, just in case. Listen, Eric Miller, thank you for this. I look forward to speaking again in the future.
My pleasure.
Well, a change of tone right now, because as we record this segment, we're now awaiting a vigil to begin in Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia. There, the Prime Minister, along with the leaders of all the opposition parties, will be taking part in a vigil this evening. The leaders also making their way to the center of town earlier in this day to lay flowers where a memorial has been set up for the people whose lives have been lost. The vast majority of those victims, of course, being children. Let's just take a listen right now and a look at the scene from earlier this afternoon. Now, we of course want to acknowledge the fact that the priority and the focus must always be on the victims, those whose lives have been lost, their families, and certainly the two young people who are right now fighting for their lives in hospital. And through this week, though, we have heard our political leaders express the grief of a nation, something that the bureau chiefs reflected on earlier today in our podcast. Take a listen to a bit of what they had to say.
For me, what struck me the most was watching in the House of Commons as members of Parliament, all sides of the House, men and women, were crying and wiping tears away because they have children or grandchildren who it shook everybody. And frankly, I was sitting in my office watching this and fighting back tears myself.
I have in my many years on the Hill seen this time and time again. Especially when it involves massive national tragedies, whether it was the Portapique shooting, whether it was the slaying of Mounties in Mayerthorpe, whether it was a school shooting in Taber, Alberta, many, many years ago. I remember when Polytechnique massacre happened. And so I think time and again, our national parliament is a venue and a voice for the nation's feelings, sorrows, and joys when we have them.
The leadership rose to the occasion. They were trying to console a nation that is in tears right now, still is, I think. We'll have a vigil tonight, and they were trying their best to not themselves, let the tears flow, trying to get, the right words at the right moment to console a nation that is really stricken by grief, and I think they rose to the occasion. And so I think that this is a moment that that should also teach us a lesson, that there is politics for a moment, but there is a moment to grief, and this is a moment to grief right now.
Now, a bit of a program note as to that vigil in Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia. You can stream that on our website, cpac.ca. But for Primetime Politics, that is our program for this Friday. I'm Michael Serapio. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again next time.